Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of What's Up with Power. My name is Justin Wagner with Team ODZ, and we're here to teach you the basics of power-based training so that you can take your training to the next level. Today we're going to be joined by Taylor Thomas from Thomas Endurance Coaching. We're going to be talking about using power for optimal workouts, and got a great presentation on there. And one of the good takeaways from this is always a discussion around when to call it quits on a workout. A lot of times you maybe not feeling it in a workout, you're not quite sure when you should call it. We'll have that discussion. So we're about a minute and a half away from the ride going live. I'm going to send some messages here to the group ride on Zwift, get us all coordinated, and I'll pull up live stream my phone so I can see your comments. But we're glad to have you. Looking forward to a great presentation. Also, listen. Discord emoji on. Okay. Change this. We've got quite the group. We've got 32 riders in the pen this morning. Definitely a large number. That's probably the largest I've ever seen for this. So, oops. So I don't feed back on myself. Okay, we got good viewers as well. Okay, 15 seconds away from the group ride. Starting. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And what I'll do once we get started here is I'll get the group rolling and I'll hand the presentation over to Taylor. Stay with me at 2. Please. Turn my volume down on my phone and getting a little feedback. Okay. I think I'm done juggling stuff. Now we can finally see Taylor. Hey Taylor, how's it going? You're on the screen now. I'm doing great. Good to have you on board for another episode. I've got the slides ready. Why don't you go ahead and take it away? I'll slide off the screen and let you go to town.
Sounds good. Well, yeah, thanks everybody for joining us this morning, my time, or a good day to you if you're elsewhere. So we're going to talk about, like Justin said, using power for optimal workouts. And so this is really kind of the next step or the evolution in training with power. You no doubt got your power meter. You hopefully established an FTP, did an FTP test. Then you use that FTP to set and calculate your training-based power zones, and then now we want to do workouts with your power meter and with those zones. So there's a bunch to talk about. Justin, you can go to the first slide if you're not already there. So a couple of things to consider when we're training with power. One of the things is when and where to train. So the first thing and kind of the most important thing to remember is that we can ride with our power meter, or should ride with our power meter, and use that for every ride. So whether that's an indoor session, an outdoor ride, a race, a group ride, whatever that is, the more that we can ride with power, the more that we can have access to that data, the better it's going to be. The more consistent the information that we get is going to be, and the more we're going to be able to learn about ourselves as athletes. So thinking about when and where to train and how that's going to impact the insights that we get from power-based training. Next is the variability of the ride. Hunter Allen and Dr. Andy Coggan in Training and Racing with a Power Meter refer to it as the stochastic nature of cycling or training with power. And so we'll get into that a little bit, and then just that the idea of power and riding is inherently variable. We're going to look at how to approach power-based intervals. Like Justin said, most importantly, when do we need to do more, and then when do we need to call it quits? We'll dive into that, and then we'll look at some workouts based on power zones. So how to use our power meter to construct specific power-based workouts and more specifically individualized power-based workouts. Next slide. So first, training opportunities. All right, when and where can we ride? And there's really, like I said, there's really no bad time to use to ride with your power meter. However, there are some standout kind of locations and some standout opportunities that training with power is going to be most impactful as it relates to our training. So indoor training, all of us are no doubt, if you've tuned into this show, set up with indoor training. That's going to be the most consistent, or one of the most consistent places to execute a workout or a ride, specifically with platforms like Training Peaks and the ability to sync your workouts and Training Peaks with other platforms like Zwift or Trainer Road, with technology like the ERG function on smart trainers. It allows or enables an athlete to produce a really, really consistent and a really, really focused effort. And so if you're okay with indoor training and you have access to the tools for indoor training, then that's going to be one of the best places to do an interval style workout. So again, most folks surely tuning into this show are familiar with that at this point. Next in line is going to be flat roads. So more specifically, flat roads that don't have any wind or very little wind are going to be a great place to use your power meter. It's going to be a great place for kind of steady state or tempo style workouts. So any long sustained intervals below threshold, a flat road is going to be great for that. And it could also be good for interval style training, depending on the interval and the length of the interval. A flat road can be great for that. Time trials. So obviously a time trial being specific to a race discipline, but power is going to really help us pinpoint a power-based pacing strategy for a time trial. So we can look at historical information. We can look at what percentage of FTP that an athlete is able to hold for a specific period of time, and then we can apply that information to a power-based pacing strategy for a time trial. And we can really pinpoint how intense an effort should be for a given length of a time trial. Next is going to be hill climbs, very similar to time trial. We can look at, again, what percentage of FTP based on the length of the climb an athlete can hold, and we can understand how much effort an athlete should be able to kind of dole out over the length of a climb. And then certainly if there's multiple climbs in a given route or race, then we can look at how much effort should be given to each of those climbs, successively during the route. Specific intervals. So again, one of the best and most effective ways to kind of utilize your power meter, doing specific intervals, and we'll get into this in greater detail further in the presentation, but just specific intervals are going to be a great place to make sure that we're pinpointing specific systems in the body or kind of critical systems in the body, and ultimately providing the opportunity for adaptation to prepare an athlete for the goals that they have, whether that's a race or a ride, or even things like building FTP or VO2 max or what have you. And then doing race-based intervals, so intervals that match and mimic the intensity of the race or the goal event that an athlete is doing. All right, so next slide. I mentioned the stochastic nature of cycling. So that's that kind of inherent variability when we look at power data. You can see from the graphic on the screen here. This is just a screen capture from kind of a normal ride for an athlete, right? So we see lots of highs, lows. We see a break in the middle. It's all over the place, right? It's not a straight line, and so understanding that it's going to be kind of bouncing all around, and that it's not going to be a straight line is going to help us kind of approach how we ride with power in a little bit more realistic way. And so one of the first things to remember is to not focus too much or worry about holding an exact average power, right? So the goal shouldn't be to go out and ride for 200 watts for 2 hours. That's just going to end up being frustrating. It's going to be relatively impossible unless it's a completely flat course with no interruptions and no wind, and you're riding solo. So the better way to approach it is to provide a range for yourself and to ensure that you stay within the range for a given ride. And so the range should correspond or correlate with the power zone that you want to stay in. So again, if it's a tempo ride, if it's a zone 2 ride, whatever the goal for that ride is, providing a range for average power that allows you to stay within that training zone is going to be the most effective and realistic way to tackle that ride. And I like to provide usually a 20 watt range is a pretty good place to start. So versus staying at 200 watts, you can go 200 to 220 watts, for instance, and that's gonna ensure that you're still targeting those desired systems in the body, but you're providing yourself a little cushion, a little leeway for changes in terrain, for other riders in a group, for instance, or wind or what have you. So stick within a range, and that'll be a much more successful way to ride. Focusing on pacing. So when we shift to power-based training, one of the things that typically happens is we begin to shift our focus, or the way that we think about pacing. We shift from a speed-based point of view to a power-based point of view. So no longer do we think about pacing in terms of miles per hour or kilometers per hour, but we think about it in terms of watts, right? And how long can we hold specific power range, and then ultimately that equates to speed. But again, tying into what I talked about, or the point above, in providing a specific range for power versus a finite number, that's going to help with pacing, right? And so as we shift from speed-based pacing to power-based pacing, we just want to make sure that we're holding a relatively consistent power for a given ride. So big spikes and huge swings in power can quickly turn a ride into a much different type of workout altogether. So consistent power and proper pacing become important. Matching the effort to the terrain. So just making sure that we're not trying to do a tempo workout and we go out on rolling terrain that makes that tempo workout into something completely different. And so again, making sure that we just think critically about matching the terrain to the types of effort and the systems in the body that we want to pinpoint. And then to further that, just understanding how terrain impacts the workout. And a good example of that is the tempo ride that I just mentioned. So if we wanted to do, say, 45 minutes in zone 3, and the course that we chose was rolling hills, what would end up happening is that we would be able to maintain that zone 3 power range up the hills, and then as we went down the hills, we would either stop pedaling, or it would be very, very hard to hold a high enough power to maintain the power range that we'd provided for ourselves. So really what's happened is that we've shifted from what was supposed to be a sustained zone 3 effort to a series of hill repeats. And so again, just understanding how that terrain impacts the workouts, and how it really at the end of the day can end up being a much different workout, and it can target very very different systems in the body if we don't match the terrain with the type of effort that we're looking to produce. Next slide. All right, so guidelines for intervals, like we talked about earlier on. One of the things that we want to do is to be able to use our power meter to create kind of highly individualized training that pinpoints key areas and key systems in the body that ultimately prepares us to reach our goals. And that goal could be a race, it could be increased FTP, it could be increased VO2 max, whatever it is. Intervals are typically the way that most athletes get there, and power is the best way to go about executing an interval-based workout. So there's a few things to know or to understand when we kind of embark on intervals with power. The first and kind of the cornerstone for interval-based workouts is going to be this idea of a repeatable interval. Right, and what a repeatable interval is basically just the third interval in a set, right? We're going to assume that the first and the second interval in a set is going to be, the athlete's going to be fairly fresh for those intervals, right? They've come out of a nice warm-up, they do the first interval, they do the second interval with a recovery period in between, and that those intervals are going to be fairly easy for that athlete. They're going to feel fresh. And to that end, they may not be indicative of the actual power that is repeatable interval after interval. So we're going to use the third interval to kind of again as our cornerstone to kind of judge the effort. And what that really allows us to do is to understand what an athlete is actually capable of. And so we're going to go back to this idea of a repeatable interval to decide if more or less intervals are needed. All right, so when to do more. The goal is to maximize our time on the bike, right? Everybody has some amount of limited time. When we go out for a workout, we want to make sure that we're getting the most out of that effort, and that we're doing just enough, but we're not doing too much. So when do we need to do more intervals so that we can maximize the adaptation and the gains that we're seeing for a given workout? So we can consult the chart here on the screen, and what this does is that this chart kind of gives us a rundown of different duration intervals, and then what the average drop in power is or should be from that repeatable interval from the third one and into the intervals that follow. So we can use the 20-minute interval at the top there as an example. If any interval past the repeatable interval or the third one is no less than a 5% decrease in average power, then you can continue to do more intervals. So if you've seen no more than a 95% decrease in power, then add another interval. Right? It's as simple as that. You can go down the list. If it's 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever it is, you can use that average drop in power, that percentage decrease range, to know if you should do more intervals. And again, that's based on the third interval and the average power from that third interval. So FTP accuracy, I think it's worth mentioning, and we've talked about it a lot. I know I've certainly talked about it a lot on this show, that it is critical that FTP be current and be accurate. And the reason it's even almost more important with this particular concept is that everything is going to be based on FTP. So we're going to establish an FTP. From that FTP, we're going to establish individualized training zones, and then from that, we're going to write interval workouts, right? So if you're doing 5-minute intervals at 105% of your FTP, and then we're looking for a percent decline from that third interval, then it really is all hinged on how accurate is your FTP. So I just wanted to reiterate how important that is to make sure that it's current, that it's accurate, that you're comfortable at that FTP, because that's really going to be the piece that ensures that all of these numbers that follow and this approach or these approaches that follow are doing their job. All right, so then if we know when to do more, when do we need to stop, right? And it's as simple as, and you probably saw this coming, if you're on the other side of this power range, then it's time to stop. So if we look at the average power for the third interval, again, we can use the 20-minute interval at the top of the chart there as an example. If you begin to see more than a 5% decrease in power after the third interval, then you're too fatigued and you should stop. And what that really means, or what that's really telling us, is that we're no longer targeting the systems in the body that we designed the workout to target, right? So if we see a decrease greater than the power range on the chart here, we can know for certain that that the workout no longer is having the effect or producing the gains or the adaptations that we wanted it to have. So you can shut it down and you can go into a cool down and wrap up the workout. All right, next slide. And then lastly, looking at workouts for power-based training. So you know, again, we know our zones. We have a properly set FTP. We know when to stop our intervals based on that repeatable interval that we talked about in the last slide. So then, what are some of the things we need to look at in terms of places to target or ways to use power for workouts? First and foremost is going to be recovery. This is often kind of the forgotten component for most athletes, right? We always want to do intervals, and we always want to think that every workout is making us you know, that much stronger, and if we do more intervals, that's going to produce more strength. But at the end of the day, recovery is critical. It should really be a constant component in your training, and really this is that 55% or below of FTP. So this is that zone 1 training that we're talking about, and it's described as embarrassingly slow, right? So that's the reason that a lot of athletes don't do it. Is it just, you know, honestly, it can just kind of be boring. But coming back to this as a home base, doing these active recovery rides helps to kind of clear the junk out of your legs from your interval workouts that you've no doubt done earlier in the week. And then you can even use this as you know, kind of a home base for some cool down efforts as well. So just being sure to use the lower ranges of those individualized training zones to come back to and make sure to allow time for proper recovery. Building muscular endurance. This gets us into the zone 2 range, and this is really the foundation for all other efforts, right? If the foundation is strong, if the base is strong, then everything above it is going to be that much stronger. And so again, this is an area that's often forgotten, but this is really one of those places that, you know, we should ride in these zones or this zone. And zone 2 is 69 to 75% of FTP. We should ride in this zone early and often. So that's going to be your early base periods. You're you know, coming into the early part of build period, and then I like to include it as a, you know, extended warm up and cool down, so that we're always kind of coming back to this as our home base, and that's going to really build your stamina. It increases heart strength, it increases muscular endurance, aerobic endurance. Zone 2 is a fantastic place to spend, you know, a fair amount of your time. And again, you can bookend workouts in this zone. You can certainly do it at the appropriate time of year. You can do long rides in this zone, but you can think about this as your foundation, and everything really is built on this zone 2 training. So definitely an important place to come back to. Sweet spot training. Most of us are familiar with sweet spot training, and really that's because it's a really effective place to spend a lot of your time, right? It's an important or an effective place to spend time early in the season if you're trying to build FTP or aerobic endurance. Really beneficial place to train. Sweet spot specifically is 89 to 94% of FTP. And that's just going to be, if you can extend the duration and the time at which you're comfortable at sweet spot, then it's gonna really bolster your strength and your endurance. It is worth mentioning that it's you don't want to spend all of your time here, because it really doesn't prepare you for the rigors of racing, right? If you spend kind of the adage is, if you spend all your time in sweet spot training, you probably won't get dropped, but you're not going to win either. So it's a good place to spend some time, again, at the appropriate time of year. Specifically early season, as you're trying to build muscular and aerobic endurance, as you're trying to increase FTP. But be sure to transition away from sweet spot training, or at least some of the bulk of the time that you spent at sweet spot, transition that to more race-based intervals. And then you can always come back to sweet spot training mid-season if you're looking for to peak again for a fall race or something like that. All right, and then what are your goals? I mentioned this, or I bring this up because, at the end of the day, power-based workouts are there to help us single out where it is we're strongest and we're weakest, and it helps us prepare to reach our goals, right? We're using power-based metrics, and we're training with power so that we can more accurately and more efficiently and effectively train to reach the goals that we have on the bike. So what are they, right? We want to make sure to identify those early on. Are they? Do you want to be a sprinter? Do you want to be a hill climber? Do you want to be a time trialist? Are you a lead out person? Whatever it is, identify those goals and then use that goal or the group of goals to write your workouts, right? To make sure that the training that you're doing is aligning with the goals that you have on the bike. And then lastly, mimicking race efforts. So I mentioned it a little bit with sweet spot training, but you don't want to spend all your time in an effort that doesn't align with what you can expect on race day. So if you expect there to be big efforts on a particular climb during a race, if you expect there to be sprints, whatever it is, make sure that the efforts and the intervals and what you're doing in training is aligning with the types of efforts that you can expect and the types of intensities that you can expect on race day. And again, all this, the caveat is, or it should be mentioned that all this has to happen or should happen at the right time of the season, right? So mimicking race efforts, sweet spot training, building muscular endurance, all of these things should be occurring at the appropriate time of year so that you're properly building the systems in the body. You're building them in succession so that the foundation is prepared before you begin to add in race specificity. But making sure that you're matching your training with your goals and that you're matching it with the intensity that you can expect in racing is going to be kind of the last piece of the puzzle as you build your training based on individualized power-based metrics and training zones. So that's all I have. I'll kick it back over to Justin. We'll go to questions and answers, and let them fly, and we'll see what we can do.
Awesome, thanks, Thomas. Great conversation, great teaching today. Lots of interesting things. So, like you said, if you have questions. We are listening in Discord. We've got Discord chat open. We've got Facebook chat open. If you want to drop a chat question in any of those, we'd be happy to address them. Maybe have you ever been in a workout and felt like you should call it quits? Curious if you've ever seen that table that talks about when you should be cutting it off and have any real experience using that table. We'd love to hear it or anything. It doesn't have to be related to what we talked about today. If you've got some other burning question that you just want to know, think we might have an answer for, let it fly. We're happy to address that. One thing I want to say I've noticed with that table of when to stop repeating intervals is I think it's pretty difficult to get to that level of stopping those intervals. What would you say, Taylor? It seems like you really got to go deep before, at least me personally, I don't know that I've actually ever gotten to the point, those thresholds where I would call it quits on a workout.
Yeah. I mean, those ranges that's basically to exhaustion, right? I mean, so that would be, to your point. I mean, that's kind of a deep and dark place to go to. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to get there. Yeah, a lot of people, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there's, a lot of people don't ever find themselves, in a position where they need to calculate that percent decline, right? Their goal is to kind of execute perfectly the workout, and they set themselves up for success, and which is fine. I think what I do with the athletes that I work with is, I think at certain points in the season or certain points in a particular training block, we actually set up workouts to go to exhaustion, right? So I'll calculate that number, or that percent decline. I'll make sure to, so we'll say, okay, at 300, if power goes below 320 watts, for, a 20-minute interval, then shut it down, and they'll produce those efforts or those intervals until they see that number. And I do that because, you don't want to do it for every workout because it's hard. But I think there's value in knowing where that limit is, and that really translates to race day performance, when you've pushed your body enough and you can understand what that threshold and that tipping point is. So yeah, like you said, it's not somewhere you want to go all the time. It's probably not going to be a place you want to you want to spend, every interval workout. Sometimes you just want to, do the intervals and finish strong and go home. But yeah, I think, as kind of breakthrough or benchmark workouts, I think it can be, there's a lot of value in knowing what that number is, and then, not pre-prescribing intervals, but going in and say, okay, I'm going to do the intervals. I'm going to go full gas until I fall away, until I can't produce that number anymore. So, you know, good approach on both sides. Set yourself up for success, and then maybe sometimes set yourself up for failure, and see what that feels like as well.
Sure. And it can be a good point of comparison over time. Like you said, it's not something you want to do all the time, but let's say different points in the year you've done this same to exhaustion workout, and you may say, hey, either maybe I'm on a new FTP this time around, or maybe I'm at the same FTP, but I've got a way higher fitness, and now I can nail like 3 or 4 more workouts. So that's a good solid 3 or 4 more intervals. So that's a good feedback to yourself that, look, the other time you absolutely left everything on the table. And if you can then come around again the next time you do it and leave even just a little bit more on the table, then your workout's helping. Okay, we've got a question here from Ron. I'm going to probably mispronounce your name, Ron, so I'm just going to say Ron. Is it effective to use a crit as an FTP test, or should I wait for a time trial or do a dedicated FTP test? I'm asking because I feel I'm due, because workouts are getting easier and it's beginning of race season, even though races are getting canceled due to storms. What would you say?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that, so obviously that ties into the point that we made about an accurate FTP. If workouts seem too easy, it's probably because they are. So it probably means there's an increase in FTP on the table there. To Ron's question, I wouldn't use a crit. That goes back to this kind of stochastic nature of cycling. The nature of a crit is usually hyper variable. And not to say that you can't set an FTP in theory on a crit, but the variability of that ride is probably going to lend itself to an inaccurate FTP. If you want to do it in a race, a time trial is pretty much just the race version of an FTP test. Obviously, the time trial has to be long enough. So if it's a 30 or 40 KTT, that would be a good place to do it. I think the thing, it's worth mentioning that if any of those things are more than 10 days away, I would do a dedicated FTP test, because what's happening is all of the workouts that you're doing up until that race are not eliciting the correct response, right? You're not targeting the key areas, and so I wouldn't wait around for a race. If it's if it's far away. If there's a if there's a time trial this weekend, then hold off and maybe do the TT, and just go out and give it full gas. But yeah, if it's more than more than a week or so away, I would get to the business of doing an FTP test, and then again, I wouldn't use the crit as a test. So that's how I'd approach it.
Yeah, and we had a pretty good discussion. I think it was last week around different FTP tests, and really the gist we came out of that was consistency. So whatever testing protocol you think is the one that fits you best, just use that over and over, because ultimately consistency and measuring yourself against the same standard is more important than maybe say the most globally accurate FTP test. I don't know that there is really such a thing, because I mean, kind of goes back to what Taylor was saying, is FTP is only one metric in your whole tool bag, right? We know it affects a lot of the other tools, but certainly there's a lot more in the tool bag. So some tests apply differently to different people based on their strengths and weaknesses, and that just kind of goes back to the fact that really I wouldn't say there's one absolute golden best FTP protocol. So hopefully,
the most important thing is just to have it, right?
Yes.
So do it consistently. And to your point, use the same protocol, and then kind of move on. It's not the be all end all. There's a tremendous amount that we can analyze, with power, and there's a lot of other metrics that are kind of driving things these days. Our understanding of FTP has changed really dramatically in the past, handful of years about, how we really understand what threshold is. So, have it, use it to write your training zones, and then, make sure it's accurate, and then move on and get to the work of doing the workouts.
Yep. Cool. Well, with that, we're going to call it a day. I want to thank you again, Taylor, for your time. If you guys have questions for him, contact him at taylor@thomasendurancecoaching.com. Check out his website, www.thomasendurancecoaching.com. He's also on Twitter, @endurance_coach is his handle. So thank you so much for your time, Taylor. And with that, say thank you to all of our watchers. We will see you next week, same time, same place. And if you've liked the content on the channel, hit like. We've got great content on here daily. All right. Thanks, guys.